Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Judy and I love history, travel, and finding out how other people live today and in the past. Last time you were introduced to Flavia, a widow of a small-time free farmer who was a citizen and a member of the plebeian class, along with her handmaiden, a woman named Yudit. Today we're going to continue our visit to the fabulous Villa Romana del Casale, described from Yudit's point of view. But first remember to like and subscribe to the channel. My day begins well before that of my mistress, who is still sleeping. You can follow me around the villa to learn about it, and to learn more about the villa itself. I am a servant. I am not a slave, and I actually do get paid, but I have to say I work every bit as long and hard as the slave, and my fate is tied to that of my mistress. Where will I go if she turns me out, or when she dies? Soon it will be time for me to help her dress and fix her hair for the day. This is a simpler matter for her because she's only middle class or plebeian than it would be for a member of the imperial court. Even so, she has a much better life, better food, and better clothing than I will ever see. Back at Olive Grove, she used to work in the fields with her husband and the field slave he purchased. She also tended the garden and supervised the house. Yes, she lived in a house, which we would call a villa, although it was tiny compared to this one. And like this one, it served as the beating heart of her master's holdings. That villa, ours in the Grove, or this one here, is much more than just a home. It's the center of a business that has made its owners wealthy, or at least allowed them to live a middle-class life. Farming and agribusiness is a multi-generational deal. Life expectancy, assuming you weren't carried off by some nameless infant disease and weren't a woman who died in childbirth during the empire, seemed short, perhaps 30 years or so, although there were many exceptions. The master's sons would have worked with him to learn the business from a very young age, while the daughters would have been married off. Female Roman citizens like my mistress had limited rights in the empire. They were expected mostly to stay home, work in the house or on the farm, and raise the children. They could not vote, of course. Women like Flavia had only as much say in their fates as first their fathers and then their husbands allowed. Once the husband died, however, things changed. Widows had more rights. They could run businesses, they could buy and sell property, and when she chooses, she can sell her husband's slaves. I hope she'll keep me with her. I try to make myself useful in any way I can. Like my mistress, I cannot read or write, but I'm clever and I have a good memory. Mostly I just want to survive whatever comes. My mistress's husband long did business with the Dominus, or master of this place. When news reached him of her husband's death, and of the fact that she wanted to sell her grove, she was invited here as a guest to discuss the terms of the sale. I hope that the terms of the sale do not include my moving on. I came along to attend her, as I have for many years. Flavia stayed in one of the guest rooms off the main peristyle. A peristyle was a large arcaded area that provided open-air living space, partially shaded under the arcade with rooms on either side. This was an important part of a Roman house, and the owners devoted an enormous amount of space to it, decorating it with plants, statuary, frescoes on the wall, and certainly mosaics on the floor. The centerpiece of the peristyle wasn't the mosaics or the frescoes, or even the statues. It was this huge water basin with a fountain in the center. I'm awake, Yudit. Yes, I can see you and your friends staring through the open doorway of my cubiculum. I do her the favor of allowing her to stay here with me in the master's cubiculum, sleeping on a pallet at the foot of my bed, instead of sending her off to the slaves' quarters, and she repays me by disappearing. Explain to this visitor what we're doing now. Mistress, I was removing the night liquids to the big bath on the other side of the peristyle. You know how valuable this stuff is. The master's slaves collect it from all over the estate, concentrating it down to reduce how much storage it requires, then dilute it as needed. They use it for cleaning clothes, degreasing wood, and for medical purposes, including gargle. If I didn't do this, I would be severely punished. The masters collect it for their own use, but it still isn't free. Like all valuable products, there is a scheme to tax it so the funds roll into the emperor's coffers. The peristyle here represents a kind of every man's land and divides the public parts of the villa from the more private parts, including the master's audience chamber or basilica. Like everything else you see in this villa, it was designed to impress anyone who saw it with the taste and wealth of the owner. The entire area under the portico is covered with mosaics like those shown here. I walked along this corridor carrying the chamber pot and emptying its rather valuable contents into a larger container located near the latrine. I did not think to show you this mosaic yesterday when I accompanied my mistress to the bath. On one edge of the peristyle, near the entry vestibule, there was a private entry to the bath complex for the use of the master, his lady, and their children. This mosaic shows you the lady of the house in the center. You can tell how important she is by the upswept hairdo and the jewelry. On each side are two rather sulky-looking children, presumably hers, and flanking them are two slaves, doing the carrying and lifting of some kind of a basket and something I can't identify. Notice that the slave on the left is a blonde. Clearly he wasn't a local boy. Perhaps he was brought to Sicily as a slave from the German territories. We Romans have long understood the importance of sanitation, and as a result, we keep our bathing areas and our latrines quite separate from one another. This small latrine serves for the master and his family and invited guests. You'll notice it has seats for several people and a channel running underneath those seats with water which would have carried away the waste. We Romans lived as civilized people, even in the countryside. There are a number of private rooms on either side of the peristyle which could have been used for any purpose, although my guess is that some of them at least served as guest rooms, like the one my mistress slept in last night. A cubiculum or bedroom in the Roman Empire was meant mostly for sleeping. You were not expected to spend much time there. They were furnished with a bed, but that was about all, and lit by a smoking oil lamp. I was able to sleep on a kind of pallet at the foot of my mistress's bed. Roman rooms could serve many purposes depending on how they were furnished, but here in the villa they were all lavishly decorated. Sometimes the decorations might give us a clue to how the rooms were used initially, but not always. Here you see the gorgeous mosaic of a dancing woman. Was she a theater performer? Was she the mistress of the house? Was this a dance studio? We don't know, and we probably never will. The way rooms in the villa were used changed over time depending on the needs of the owner. Here we can see the exercising bathing beauties, but that mosaic was layered on top of an earlier and much plainer floor. Sports were an important part of daily Roman life, and women did participate. The young women performed sports including weightlifting, discus throwing, running, and ball games. A woman in the toga on the bottom left offers a crown and the victor's palm to the winner of the games. I accompanied my mistress as she made her way to the master's basilica, or meeting room. We were astounded by the size of the entryway and the beauty of the huge mosaic that faced the entire basilica, and the number of men waiting to do business inside the basilica with the Dominus, but even greater number of people waiting outside. While they waited, they were able to study the world, the Roman world, based on what they saw in this Roman mosaic. My mistress had business with the Dominus, and we were able to walk through the peristyle to his audience chamber. The audience chamber was sectioned off somewhat from the peristyle by this long hallway, decorated with a floor depicting a huge hunt. The floor shows many hunting scenes, not just those that could have taken place here on this island, but in all the Roman provinces. On the left, we see a detail of some Romans trying to load an unwilling elephant into a boat. On the right is obviously a hunt, also of Romans chasing after something like an addax or a gazelle. I think the men who made these mosaics were familiar with the animals in real life, and not just from a picture book. The depictions of the elephant and leopard speak to the fact of Rome's domination of Africa, and possibly to the fact that the mosaicists were slaves from Africa who were familiar with the animals in real life. This enormous presence chamber was called a basilica. I think I'll let one of my visitors who has seen them elsewhere tell you about it. Today we think of a basilica as being the same as a church, and in a way it was to the Romans, only instead of worshiping God, the visitors came here to conduct business and pay their respects to the master of the manor. During the time of the Roman Empire, a basilica was a separate large public building with multiple functions that was typically built alongside the town's forum. I think we could consider that the great hunting scene mosaic served as the villa's forum. We know that the Villa Romana del Casale could be thought of as a kind of town, so the presence of the basilica here isn't really as odd as it might seem. If we think back to what we've seen walking through the small part of the villa that we have passed through, we'll remember that the rooms became somewhat more elaborate and more highly decorated as we moved from the outside gateway, through the baths, the peristyle, across the great hunt corridor, and arrived here. This was an unusual room. It was obviously 2 stories and had a kind of dome under which there would have sat a large chair analogous to a throne. Enough remains of it to suggest that the entire floor had either been mosaiced or floored with various kinds of decorative inlaid marble. In some areas, the marble extended upward into the walls. The room was decorated with far more than just mosaic or marbled floors and frescoes. There would have been plants and statuary. This enormous presence chamber was called a basilica. I think I'll let one of my visitors who has seen them elsewhere tell you about it. Today we think of a basilica as being the same as a church, and in a way it was to the Romans, only instead of worshiping God, the visitors came here to conduct business and pay their respects to the master of the manor. During the time of the Roman Empire, a basilica was a separate large public building with multiple functions that was typically built alongside the town's forum. I think we could consider that the great hunting scene mosaic served as the villa's forum. We know that the Villa Romana del Casale could be thought of as a kind of town, so the presence of the basilica here isn't really as odd as it might seem. If we think back to what we've seen walking through the small part of the villa that we have passed through, we'll remember that the rooms became somewhat more elaborate and more highly decorated as we moved from the outside gateway, through the baths, the peristyle, across the great hunt corridor, and arrived here. This was an unusual room. It was obviously 2 stories and had a kind of dome under which there would have sat a large chair analogous to a throne. Enough remains of it to suggest that the entire floor had either been mosaicked or floored with various kinds of decorative inlaid marble. In some areas, the marble extended upward into the walls. The room was decorated with far more than just mosaic or marbled floors and frescoes. There would have been plants and statuary. I was told that on either side of the basilica were the master's suite of rooms and the mistress's suite of rooms, and I think that although the master and his family had access to the public latrine, as well as the private latrine near the bath, it's far more likely they enjoyed the privacy of what's called the little lavatory, located nearer to the apartments. Even though it was little, it still seated several people, and it featured the kind of running water waste removal that we saw earlier. Now that my mistress has met with the Dominus of this place and managed to negotiate the sale of the olive grove, it's time for us to think about heading home by walking through a second peristyle, which they called the oval peristyle. Romans were very practical people. This was a garden, but it didn't just sit here in isolation. There were rooms on either side, possibly guest rooms, but also a huge dining room. The far end of the peristyle boasted a fountain as well, this time with a nymphaeon, a shrine devoted to a minor deity called a nymph. Nymphs were associated with water, grottos, forests, and fountains. Beyond the nymphaeum were 2 large service rooms, and off to the right, a kitchen. When the peristyle was in use, there would have been potted plants and statuary to decorate it. It was pleasant, but also a real extravagance. The owner could obviously afford the expense. If the oval peristyle was meant to impress, the dining room was meant to dazzle. It's currently called the triapsidal triclinium, which means 3-apsed dining room. The area was roofed in antiquity because it was meant as an interior room, not a garden. The glass you see today was also there for a good reason. Very good mosaics actually survived in this area, mostly intact. The photo you see on the right shows you one of the apses after which the room was named. Had we been invited in, after dinner our host would have bid us farewell, and we would have retired to a guest room, perhaps one of the rooms surrounding the new peristyle. We've had a very long day, and like our guides Flavia and her maidservant Yudit, it's time to bid farewell to the villa. This doesn't mean we magically vacate the territory of this former latitudium, which scholars believe extended for several days in every direction. Agriculture has always been a big business here in Sicily, and access to its productive capabilities is one reason why the Romans were so keen to conquer and colonize the island in the first place. People lived in more places than just the villa, however. People lived all over the latitudium. These Romanized Sicilians built their own establishments, far more modest than this villa, but historically significant as well. Mostly those buildings have vanished, but the sturdy Roman foundations can still be found, and the area is still heavily farmed. One of them houses a restaurant called the Ristorante Agriturismo Trinacria, which is located quite close to the archaeological site. These restaurants are always part of a farm and generally feature food products grown on the site. We will visit another agriturismo in our stay in Palermo. Meanwhile, thank you for joining me today, and come back next week for another tour here on the Armchair Traveler.